All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is why you should never start a goal from zero. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, the weight of zero, the 20% start, continuing instead of starting, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. So before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. If you want this training along with its respective document, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters helping you improve every aspect of your life, then make sure to join the newsletter, again, from the link in the description. With that said, let's get started and talk about the weight of zero. So you've probably set a goal at some point in your life that genuinely mattered to you. Maybe it was about your body, maybe it was about your money, your relationships, your craft, or who you wanted to become as a person. And somewhere along the way, despite caring about it, despite knowing it mattered, you stopped. And that pattern repeats for almost everyone across almost every area of life. And it's because nobody ever explains the invisible thing that can quietly kill goals before the work even begins. Now, most people assume the problem is effort. They think if they could just want it more or work harder or stay disciplined for longer, the goal would happen. So they keep doubling down on effort, which is the one thing that wasn't actually the issue. And when effort alone doesn't fix it, then the shame shows up, right? You start feeling like the problem is you, like other people have something that you don't. And that story is comforting in a bit of a dark way because at least it gives you the failure. It gives the failure an explanation, even if it's the wrong one. And so the truth is much less personal. There's a specific psychological weight that crushes goals in the first stretch. And almost nobody is taught how to handle it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it changes how you approach every goal from then on. So the weight is very invisible, which is part of why it's so deadly. You can't fight what you can't name. So people keep trying to muscle through a force that they don't realize is even acting on them. And because the force is invisible, well, the diagnosis is almost always wrong. People blame motivation or their time or their energy or their environment and sometimes themselves, when the real culprit can sit one layer underneath all of those, quietly steering the whole thing. Which is why the same pattern keeps repeating across years. Same kind of goal, same kind of stall, same kind of guilt, different decade. And that cycle is really just a missing piece of understanding. Now, with that in mind, I want to walk you through a study that explains the whole thing in a way that's almost embarrassingly simple once you see it. So back in 2006, two researchers named Joseph Nunes and Xavier Dreze, and I might be butchering this name, ran a now famous experiment at a car wash. And what they found is small on the surface but massive underneath. And it quietly rewrites how you should think about every goal in your life. So here's what they really did. They handed one group of customers a loyalty card that needed 8 stamps to earn a free wash. And they handed another group a card that needed 10 stamps, but it came with 2 stamps already filled in for free. So if you look at the math, both groups had the exact same amount of real work to do. 8 stamps, right? Same reward at the end, which is obviously the free wash, and same effort required. But nothing about the actual goal changed between the two groups, right? It's both of them had to reach 8 stamps in order to get that free wash. Except one had 8 from the get-go, and the other one had 10 with 2 already filled in. Now, logically, both groups should have had similar completion rates because the work was equal, the prize was equal, the path was equal. A purely rational view of human behavior would predict no meaningful difference between them. But human behavior is almost never purely rational. And what happened next is really the part that should make you sit up a little because it quietly explains years of stalled goals in your own life. Now, the group that started with 2 stamps already filled in completed the card almost twice as often as the other group. Same workload, same reward, wildly different finish line and finish rate. The only thing that really changed was the feeling of having already started. So researchers also noticed those people moved faster, not just more often, but with more urgency. That tiny sense of advancement seemed to inject momentum into the actual behavior, almost like a battery getting charged up. Now, beyond speed, they also showed more stamina. They stuck with it even when things got slow or boring. The progress they'd already seen kept feeding them in the background long after the initial excitement faded. So, the lesson buried in that study is the single most important thing I'm going to teach you in this video. People are dramatically more likely to finish a goal when they feel they've already started one. And the actual distance to the finish line didn't really change. Only the perception of progress changed. And it's that perception alone that almost doubled the completion rate. And what that tells you is that your brain doesn't really respond to the objective size of a goal. It responds to where it thinks you are on the path. If you feel close, then you push harder. If you feel far, then you stall. And so distance in the mind is emotional before it's logical. A goal that feels miles away gets treated almost like a threat, even if the actual workload is reasonable. So your motivation gets drained before you've even tried. Closeness flips that completely. The moment a goal feels reachable, your brain leans in. You get curious, energized, focused, and willing to keep going through small obstacles that would have stopped you earlier because you feel like you're closer to completion. And so once you see this pattern, you start spotting it everywhere. Fitness, business, learning, relationships, recovery, money. Anywhere a long-term outcome is involved, perceived progress runs the show. Now, with that study sitting in the background, let's talk about what zero actually does to you, because I think this is the part that almost nobody explains. So starting at 0% is not a neutral starting position if you think about it. It's an emotionally loaded place that works against you from day one. Now, a goal at 0% feels far away in a way that your brain can barely tolerate. You look at the gap between where you are now and where you want to be, and your mind basically decides the climb is too much. So you stall, you scroll, you delay, and you tell yourself you'll begin tomorrow. So when a goal sits at 0, it has no shape yet. There's no first move. There's no obvious anchor. There's no clear thing to grab onto. And it's that vagueness that makes it really easy to walk away, because nothing about it really feels urgent or real. Without a clear anchor, your attention just basically scatters towards easier things almost automatically, and you end up busy with small wins that don't necessarily move you anywhere meaningful. And the actual goal really slinks slowly into the background of your life. Now, vague goals also breed quiet doubt. You start wondering if you're even cut out for it, if it's the right goal, if the timing is off. None of that's real analysis. That's just your mind looking for an excuse to really escape the discomfort of 0. And so distant goals get processed almost like threats. Your body basically tightens, your motivation drops, your willpower starts leaking before any real action happens. And that's why you can feel exhausted just thinking about something you haven't even started yet. So you avoid the goal without consciously meaning to. You clean, you organize, you plan, you research, you reorganize, and plan again. Anything that feels productive without necessarily forcing you to actually face the climb, to actually work on the goal. And then on top of the avoidance comes a layer of quiet shame, because you should be taking action on the goal, but you're not. And that small gap between what you're intending to do and what you're actually doing becomes its own private kind of pain. Now, 0 also messes with how you see yourself in relation to the goal. When the progress bar feels empty, you don't feel like someone actually pursuing the goal. You feel like someone hoping for it, which is a much weaker position to operate from than actually seeing yourself as somebody that's taking action towards the goal. So you start treating the goal like something you're outside of, looking in. And it's that distance that turns the goal into a fantasy rather than an actual project you're working on. And fantasies almost never get built, right? Because nothing about them demands action today. So it seems like you're just daydreaming. And from that outsider position, every move feels oversized. You hesitate to make the first call, to write the first draft, to take the first set, to send the first message. And these small steps start to feel enormous, even when they're objectively tiny. So you also start comparing yourself to people already deep into the same goal. They look further ahead than you, more capable than you, more deserving of the result. So you sit on the sidelines a little longer and just watch. And then there's the pretender feeling, because even when you do start, part of you suspects you don't really belong yet, because the progress bar still reads empty. And that little voice quietly drains the energy out of every early action you take. which is why so many goals get abandoned in the first 2 weeks and then restarted from scratch a month later, because a part of you still wants the goal, but every reset places you back at zero. And every time you do that, the weight of zero gets a little heavier. And here's where most self-improvement advice gets this completely wrong. And this is the part I really want you to pay attention to. Most people are told that the answer to the weight of zero is more discipline, more motivation, more grit, more drive. And that framing is a trap, and it keeps you stuck for years. Telling someone to push through zero is like telling someone to lift a piano with their teeth. It can be done technically, but it's a terrible plan. Willpower is a real resource, sure, but it's a limited one, and it was never designed to carry the full weight of a long-term goal. Lean on willpower too hard and you burn out fast. You get a few intense days, maybe a strong week, and then you crash. And after the crash, you blame yourself instead of the strategy you started with. And so the goal quietly dies under a pile of guilt and shame. Now, pure willpower is also very fragile. One bad sleep, one stressful day, one emotional hit, and the whole plan collapses. A goal can't survive on a system that breaks the moment life gets normal. So the real move is really to stop being at zero in the first place. And that's a totally different game. And it's the game that actually works. And it's also what the Nunes and Drese finding was quietly pointing at the whole time. Goal progress is mostly perception. Momentum is really just a feeling. It's perception. How close you feel matters almost as much as how close you actually are. So if you shift the perception, then the behavior follows. That's not a trick. That's just how human mind handles long-term effort. So the work is upstream. Before you push, you set up the climb in a way that doesn't require superhuman drive. You build the conditions that make movement feel natural, because forcing yourself into motion will always lose to designing yourself into it. So conditions beat character almost every time. If you put a disciplined person in a bad setup, they'll struggle. If you put an average person in a brilliant setup, then they'll glide. Right? Goals get achieved by good design, not just good intentions. And this is the leverage point most people miss. You don't need to become a different person to hit your goal. You just need to stop standing at zero, because zero is the actual enemy here, not you. So let's talk about the 20% start. So the whole thing comes down to one thing, which is that you never let your brain experience a goal as 0% complete, not even for a single day at the start. You want to walk into every goal already feeling like the process is underway, the same way those car wash customers felt the moment they saw 2 free stamps sitting on their card before they'd done anything. That feeling of being already in motion, already having momentum, is really what carries you through the first stretch, which is exactly where almost everyone else quits. So instead of fighting the heaviness of a fresh start, you want to remove the heaviness entirely by refusing to begin at zero. You want to be fixing a completely different problem here. So the core principle is simple enough that you can carry with you for the rest of your life and apply it to anything that you want to. You're almost never truly at zero on a goal that you actually care about, if you really think about it, even when it feels like you're standing at the very bottom looking up. The reason it feels like zero is that you've never gathered your real progress into one place where you can actually see it. Once you understand that, well, the whole problem stops being about motivation and really is about perception. So most of your real progress stays completely hidden from you, scattered across months or even years of quiet effort that you never really bothered to count. You've thought about this goal more times than you realize, most likely. You've tried small pieces of it. You've learned hard lessons from the attempts that didn't work. You've gathered tools and most likely a lot of knowledge about it along the way without ever tallying any of it. So your brain looks at the goal, finds no organized evidence of movement or progress or momentum, and defaults to reading the whole thing as empty. Meanwhile, the truth is usually sitting closer to 20%. You just haven't looked properly. So your past attempts count for far more than you give them credit for, even the ones you'd rather forget about completely. Every failed try handed you specific information about what doesn't work, which narrows the path and makes the next attempt sharper than the last. And that accumulated knowledge is real, usable progress, and it lives in you right now, whether you acknowledge it or not. So if it's there, regardless of if you acknowledge it or not, well, you might as well acknowledge it, right? Because it moves you closer to the goal. You tend to file those attempts under wasted time when really they were tuition you already paid. So your existing assets count as well. And there are almost always more of them than you'd guess on first looks. Think about the skills you already have, the people you already know, the tools and resources and knowledge already sitting around in your life waiting to be used. None of that is zero. And yet you walk straight past all of it on your way to convincing yourself you're a total beginner. When you actually stop and count it, the picture shifts in your favor a lot quicker. So the first move is this reframe. And it's a genuinely powerful one once you actually do it instead of just nodding. You stop asking what you have to do from scratch, which is the question that makes everything feel impossibly far away, and rather, you ask yourself what's already true that points you towards this goal, which immediately starts filling in part of the progress bar before you've even lifted a finger. And it's that change in the opening question that changes the entire emotional weight of the goal. And this is where you sit down and you actually take a genuinely honest inventory of everything that already counts in your favor. You write it all down on paper or a screen, no matter how small, scattered, or unrelated each piece feels in the moment, and you actually look at it and see that you've made a ton of progress without even actually acknowledging it. The simple act of seeing it gathered in one place does something real and almost physical to your sense of momentum, because you're not making anything up. You're finally just collecting all of the progress that was already there. And it's that inventory that then becomes proof, and proof is exactly what your brain has been wanting this entire time. And once you can physically look at 10 or 15 things that you know you've already begun, well, the goal stops registering as a cold, intimidating beginner start, and you'll see it as the continuation of something that's already been moving for a while, despite the fact that it might have been slower because you haven't necessarily been collecting any of the evidence that you've made progress, which is a completely different thing to wake up to, right? And continuation, you'll see, is dramatically easier to sustain than beginning. Now, a simple 4-part process turns any goal you have into a 20% start, and you can run the whole thing in about 15 minutes today. And each step is designed to build real, visible momentum before your willpower is ever asked to carry the load. You move in order from gathering what already exists to shrinking the first action to making everything visible to locking in the right frame. And done together, these 4 steps make the goal feel like it's already rolling downhill. So first, you build your inventory of existing progress, which is the foundation everything else rests on that we just covered. You sit down with the goal clearly in mind, and you list out everything that you already have working in your favor right now. It could be past attempts, it could be hard lessons, it could be relevant skills, it could be useful resources and knowledge, it could be helpful contacts, and any small action you've already taken all belong on this list. Now, the longer and more honest the list, the stronger the foundation you're building underneath the goal. So the key in this step is just brutal honesty pointed in your favor for once, which is something most people never practice. You're usually painfully honest about your shortcomings and weirdly blind to your strengths and progress. So flip that same harsh honesty towards your assets instead. And when you do, you'll be genuinely surprised at how much is already sitting there, fully real and completely uncounted. Fully objectively true, right? We're not making anything up here. We're actually taking objective truth and just pointing your attention to it. And so that surprise is the moment the goal starts to feel survivable. So aim for at least 10 items on this list, even when some of them feel almost embarrassingly tiny. Volume matters more than you'd think here, since a long list of small things creates a far stronger sense of progress than a short list of impressive ones. So the sheer quantity is doing real psychological work by itself because it builds the weight of momentum item by item. So you keep adding and then resist the urge to filter for what sounds good. And don't dismiss the small stuff, because dismissing it is the exact mistake almost everyone makes. A single book you read on the topic, or one honest conversation you had about it, or one relevant tool you already own and know how to use that can help you towards it, each of those is a stamp on your card. And the whole point of the car wash study is that stamps add up faster than logic says they should. So you need to treat the tiny wins as fuel. And let the list stay messy, raw, and imperfect, because it isn't a polished document that anyone else will ever read, right? It's private evidence assembled for your own brain. So completeness and honesty matter far more than neatness or presentation. If anything, The rough, overflowing version works way better than a clean one because it feels alive rather than curated. So just get it all down and just keep moving. Second, you compress the very first milestone until it becomes almost laughably, embarrassingly easy to complete. Don't point yourself at the whole goal, since obviously the whole goal is precisely the thing that makes your brain freeze up and stall. Instead, aim at the smallest possible first move, first action that proves the process is real and gives your mind its first genuine taste of motion. And that first taste matters far more than its size suggests. So make the first step so small that skipping it would feel almost silly, like talking yourself out of something that takes 2 minutes. It could be one paragraph, it could be one short walk around the block, it could be one message sent to the right person. The size of the step is really not the point here and never was. The real point is the simple act of getting the wheels turning at all. And once they're turning, keeping them turning is a much easier job. Now, whatever first step you choose, make absolutely sure you can finish it today before you sleep. No exceptions. So same day completion matters enormously since it converts the goal from a floating idea in your head into something you've already physically acted on in the real world. And so that single finished action quietly rewrites your entire relationship to the goal because you go to bed as someone who has started, not someone who plans to. Now, third, you make the progress visible because progress your brain can't actually see barely registers as progress at all. So as we discussed, progress is to a big degree perception. Momentum is to a big degree perception. So if you don't have evidence that in any way shows that you've made progress or creates that perception of momentum, then you won't feel like you're 20% there already. So a simple checklist or a habit tracker or a calendar streak or a basic page or a rough chart all work perfectly well for this. The exact format doesn't really matter that much as the fact that you can look at it and see movement with your own eyes. So pick whatever you'll actually use and stop optimizing the tool. And keep in mind, your brain genuinely needs to see the movement. It shouldn't be just thinking about it in the abstract, which is a distinction that a lot of people miss entirely, right? A visible tracker takes effort that would otherwise be invisible and turns it into something concrete you can physically look at and point to. And so every single time you glance at it, you collect another small free hit of momentum without doing any extra work. So put your tracker somewhere you'll genuinely see it every day, not somewhere where it will quietly disappear from your attention. So a tracker buried in a drawer or a forgotten app does absolutely nothing for you. It beats the whole purpose of what we're doing here, no matter how nicely you set it up. So once sitting on your desk, your wall, or your phone's home screen will keep the sense of progress alive in the background of your daily life, because visibility at the end of the day is what keeps the momentum from going cold. Now, once you've got a few marks down in a row, a streak will start to form, and streaks turn out to be weirdly, almost irrationally powerful. You start not wanting to break the chain you've built, even when your motivation is lower on a given day, and that small nagging reluctance to lose your run really becomes a quiet engine that keeps you showing up, and it's a gentle pressure, but it works. And so that visible progress also feeds your brain the exact feedback it was starving for back when the goal felt frozen and flat. No feedback means no fuel, which is the real reason a lot of motivation flatlines around week 2 for most people. And so this single step directly repairs the most common failure point in the entire goal pursuit process, right? Keep the feedback flowing and the engine keeps running. And if you look at video games, there's constant feedback on our actions. Why? Because feedback to a big degree is addicting. And so you need to give yourself that feedback for your goal all the time, and you make it a bit more addictive to keep running towards that goal. Now, fourth and finally, you tell yourself the plain truth, but in the right frame, which turns out to matter way more than the truth itself. So you're not starting from nothing here, right? You're continuing something that's already in motion. And that's the frame that you should look at it from. That small change in framing carries a surprising amount of weight, and it quietly changes how heavy every future action feels. Now, from here on, you're just maintaining momentum rather than manufacturing it, right? So the way you frame the goal inside your own head directly shapes how heavy it feels to take action on it. So continuing something that's already moving feels a lot lighter, natural, and almost obvious to keep doing. Starting something from a dead cold stop feels heavy, intimidating, and easy to put off until some better day that never arrives. So that same exact action has a wildly different emotional cost depending on the frame and the words you use for it. So this step also quietly repairs the identity problem we talked about earlier in the section, where you stop being the outsider standing at the window hoping that the goal happens for you someday, and you're now someone already in the thick of pursuing it, which is a far stronger and steadier place to actually take action from, right? And acting from that identity makes every step afterwards feel like it belongs to you. And so this is not about necessarily lying to yourself, right? Or pretending that you're somehow further along than you genuinely are, which can be a real risk worth naming, because fake confidence built on nothing solid really collapses the instance reality tests it, and it usually collapses at the worst possible moment. The entire power of this approach comes from organizing the genuine, real progress and momentum that you've just been overlooking, never from inventing progress that simply isn't there, right? Keep it real and it will hold. But most people just don't pay attention to the progress they've already made, to the momentum they've already made, to their strengths. So everything you place on that progress bar has to be real. It has to be verifiable and actually yours. Like actual real past effort, real existing skills, real resources, real lessons learned, real completed actions you can point to, real, books read, etc. It can be anything. The strength of this entire method lives in the gathering of true progress that you've been ignoring, not in manufacturing a flattering story that won't really survive. So real inputs are the only thing that produces a durable output here. And so there's a big important difference between perceiving your progress accurately and quietly deluding yourself about it. One approach gathers evidence that genuinely exists and simply hadn't been counted yet. The other manufactures a comfortable fantasy that feels good for a week and then it completely gets destroyed by real life. So the first builds durable momentum that you can actually stand on, while the second sets you up for a harder, more demoralizing crash down the line. And so real progress also keeps your self-trust fully intact because you're not lying to yourself. And self-trust is everything over the long run, if you ask me. When you only count what's actually true, you genuinely believe your own tracker when you look at it each day. So that belief is precisely what gives the whole method its staying power across months and even years of pursuit. If you break that trust with yourself with inflated numbers or fake progress, well, the entire system stops working. The entire system loses purpose. So the honest reframe is the one that actually holds up under pressure when things get hard and the early excitement is basically long gone. So you're not almost never at zero because you're cleverly fooling yourself into feeling good. You're almost never at zero because real legitimate progress was genuinely there the whole time, just scattered around and never counted and never looked at and never paid attention to. And that's a fact about your situation. I'm not trying to motivate you here or lie to you. Your actual job is then pretty refreshingly simple, which is to gather that scattered progress together. Pull the loose pieces in one single visible place where your brain can finally register all of them at once. And that one act of gathering is really what flips the goal from frozen and intimidating to moving and approachable. Nothing about your circumstances changed, only your view of them did. And so once you've gathered all of that in front of you, the goal has already begun, right? You've already begun work with no exaggeration required, no lying to yourself required, no faking required. And again, it's not wishful thinking. It's an accurate, honest read of exactly where you already stand, which is, as it turns out, when you look closely, was never actually zero in the first place. You just hadn't done the counting yet. You just hadn't paid attention to your own progress yet. So the goal was always closer than it was. So let's talk about continuing instead of starting. So starting and continuing are not the same act, right? Even though they look identical from the outside, starting is where all the fear lives, all the doubt, all that weird resistance that makes you suddenly want to reorganize your desk instead. continuing is just moving something that's already moving, which your brain treats as a completely different thing and much lighter job. So think about where the resistance actually shows up in your life, because it's almost never in the middle of doing something. It's usually at the start. The hardest day of any workout plan isn't day 40, it's day 1, when the whole thing is still cold and theoretical. The same goes for writing, building a business, learning a language, fixing your finances, all of it. Once you're rolling, the friction drops off a cliff, which tells you the real enemy was the start, not the work. And so this is basically inertia, the same way it works with anything physical you've ever pushed. Getting a heavy thing to move from a dead stop takes way more force than keeping it moving once it's going. And your goals behave the same exact way. And your willpower is really the force you're spending. So if you can skip the dead stop entirely, you save the biggest chunk of your energy you'd otherwise burn. And so that first push is brutal precisely because nothing's helping you yet. There's no momentum, there's no streak, there's no visible progress, nothing pulling you forward. So you're carrying the whole load alone, and it feels heavy because it's genuinely heavy in that moment. And most people read that heaviness as proof that they're not cut out for it, when really it's just physics. And so after that first push, everything starts to help you instead. Your tracker's got marks on it, your streak is alive, your brain's getting feedback, and the goal feels real now. All those forces start pulling in the same direction as you, so the work that felt impossible on day 1 feels almost ordinary by day 10. And so the trick, if you want to call it that, is to never actually experience a real dead stop. You walk in already having gathered your progress, already feeling momentum, already standing at 20% instead of 0. And that way, the brutal first push is mostly behind you before you consciously begin. Because you're not starting the engine from 0. You're not starting from cold. You're picking up something that's already warm. And so when you skip the dead stop, you skip the part where most goals die. Most people never fail at the work itself. They fail at the beginning, at the ignition of it, and that first cold morning where everything feels too far away. So take that moment off the table and you've already beaten the odds. It honestly feels like cheating to a degree, except it's completely legitimate. And so from there, you mostly glide, and gliding is sustainable in a way that grinding never is, right? You're not forcing your way through with raw discipline. You're riding momentum that you set up on purpose. And that's the difference between people who finish and people who keep restarting. One group designed the glide, the other keeps trying to start from 0. And so there's another layer to this that's actually worth noting, which is how continuity changes the story you tell yourself. Because when you're continuing, you're not some hopeful beginner anymore, right? You're a person with a track record, even though it might be a smaller one, but there's a track record nonetheless. And that track record becomes part of who you are, and people protect what feels like part of them. So the goal stops being something you're chasing and is now something you're just defending. And your streak does a lot of heavy lifting here, because once you've strung together a handful of days, breaking the chain starts to feel like a real loss, almost painful. You don't want to throw away what you've built, so you show up even on the days that you don't feel like it. And it's that little bit of loss aversion that ends up being one of your most reliable tricks here. And slowly, the way you talk about yourself also changes without you forcing it, because now you're no longer trying to get in shape or trying to build the thing. You just start saying you do it, right? And that quiet change in self-description is also one of the strongest signals you're going to finish. Once the goal becomes part of your identity, quitting would feel like betraying yourself, and most people won't do that. So let's zoom out for a second and be honest about what's really at stake, because this is bigger than one goal, right? The weight of 0 isn't just costing you this particular thing that you're after right now. It's been there costing you across your whole life, goal after goal, year after year, without you ever seeing the pattern. Every time you stalled at the start and blamed yourself, the real culprit was just an empty progress bar that nobody taught you how to fill. So if you look back honestly, you'll probably spot the same shape repeating over and over. There was a goal you cared about, a strong start in your head, and then a slow fade as the distance to the finish line wore you down. And it happened with different goals in totally different areas, which rules out the idea that it was about the specific goal. The common thread was always you standing at 0, feeling the weight and basically backing away. And the cost of all these abandoned goals adds up to something that can be genuinely heavy over the years. Not just the goals themselves you lost, it's the slow erosion of trust in your own word. And so every restart from zero chipped away a little more at your belief that you actually can follow through. And it's that erodes your self-trust and then makes the next goal even harder to start, which is a nasty loop to be stuck in. And that loop is exactly what this whole approach is really built to break, right at the source. You stop starting from zero, so you stop stalling at the start, so you stop quitting in week 2, which means you start finishing things, and finishing things slowly rebuilds the self-trust you've been bleeding out. So the real promise here goes way past whatever goal you're holding in mind today. If you learn to fill the progress bar before you begin, then you've got a tool you'll use on every meaningful goal for the rest of your life. Whether it's health, money, relationship, skill, the whole lot of it really bends to the same simple principle once you internalize it. You're not going to try to win once, you're changing how you approach every goal from here on out. And so these wins compound in a way that changes your trajectory over time, because each finished goal makes the next one feel more possible, since now you've got proof that you're the kind of person who finishes and your confidence is up, and that growing pile of proof becomes its own permanent 20% start on everything new you attempt. So the people who master this don't just hit one goal, they start hitting most of them. And underneath all of that, what's really being rebuilt is your belief in yourself. Not the fake, hyped up kind that fades by Tuesday, but the earned kind that comes from actually doing what you said you would. And that belief is the most valuable asset you'll ever build, and it's the real prize hiding behind every individual goal, because everything else downstream is downstream of really trusting your own word again and doing what you say you're going to do. And once that momentum is rolling across your whole life, well, stopping starts to feel way stranger than just continuing. You become someone in motion by default, with progress bars filling everywhere you look. And honestly, that's a completely different way to move through your life than starting cold over and over again. It's lighter, steadier, and far more like the person you actually want it to be. So if we bring it all the way back down to the ground, to what you actually do with it starting tomorrow morning, you can pick one goal that genuinely matters to you, and you refuse to let yourself begin at zero. You gather all the real progress that's already there, you shrink the first step until it's super tiny, you make it visible, and you tell yourself the truth that you're continuing rather than just starting over from scratch. And that's the whole thing, and it's more than enough to change the outcome. So the beauty of this is how genuinely simple it is to actually put into practice, which is rare for a lot of stuff that actually works. There's no complicated system to learn or some kind of an app you need to buy or morning routine to overhaul before you're allowed to start. You just count what's real, take one small action today, and keep the progress where you can genuinely see it. Simple works, right? And the best part is you can run the whole thing today in the next 15 minutes with a goal you already have. You don't have to wait for Monday or the new month or some perfect moment that's never going to show up anyway. The progress is already sitting there waiting to be counted, so the only real question is whether you'll go count it. There's genuinely nothing stopping you from starting your 20% right now. And once you've done it, even once, you'll feel the difference immediately, and it's hard to go back after that. The goal that felt cold and far away suddenly feels already underway. And is that change that's the whole point. And it's available to you the moment you decide to gather your progress instead of staring at the climb. So go do it and let the goal feel like something you're continuing rather than something you're dreading and starting from scratch. So with that said, let's cover the review. We talked about the overview, the weight of zero, the 20% start, continuing instead of starting, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. First, pick one goal that matters and list at least 10 real things that prove you've already started, and then read the list back to yourself. Choose the smallest possible first step and finish it today before you sleep, so the goal stops being an idea and actually becomes something that you're acting on. And then set up one visible tracker you'll see every day. And from now on, treat every goal as something you're continuing rather than something you're starting from zero, because most of the time you're most likely continuing the goal anyway rather than starting from zero. With that said, if you want to start your 20% right now, you can book a call and work with me one-on-one. If you want this document along with its respective training, then make sure to join the free community. And if you want weekly newsletters on basically how to improve every aspect of your life, then make sure to join the free newsletter, again, from the link in the description. With that said, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.